All right, let me go ahead and hit this live button. Oh yeah, I forgot I can't stream this Twitter because I am presently blo- uh, blocked on Twitter for basically calling someone a useful idiot. So there you go. Don't call people useful idiots on Twitter, even when they're actually being a useful idiot. It's not good for you. So I disputed it, so we'll see. We'll see where it lands. Crow, what's up, brother? Let's see who else shows how many of the perps actually show up since this is kind of a pop-up stream that I want to test this computer with this network, see whether I can actually pull off a stream without having a stroke, like it was doing over on the other one. It's broken. It probably is. Um, this may be a computer where I can only just stream and talk and not share all the goodies that I normally share. But we're gonna try it. Just cause. So P38, what's up? So we're gonna give it a whirl. Sam, what's happening, brother man? Um, this case was actually, I want to say it was last week, maybe the week before. So this is an appeals case. I think it's United States versus or Bruce versus United States. It's about a high capacity magazine. Um, that's what I'm going to try to share out with the peeps. So this, I mean, this was just I think this month when this was argued on appeal. Now, trying to find out which exact case this is. I had some other stuff pulled up, but it was not a very cool dude. He seemed to be kind of a shithead. And I think he got caught a bunch of other charges, but they were arguing over the high capacity magazine ban. And if you guys pay attention sometimes, our rights are normally not affirmed because a good person gets caught doing something and gets busted. It's normally because some shithead does something and then it goes through court and our rights kind of get protected that way. It's just it's the way it rolls, man. Normally folks like us aren't sitting around in jail, although I have been there before. I don't recommend it. Let's see. Let's see if I can share this without this computer having a fucking stroke. We're just gonna do a screen share. Which one is this one? La da da da. Now there's a couple things um, with this case and with what these judges are arguing, and you got to listen to these judges. There's one case they talk about in here, they reference in here. I've got to try to find that case because they basically said that a gun was a machine gun merely because it held a large number of rounds in the magazine. Yeah, it wasn't functioning like a machine gun. Didn't have some extra shit done to a trigger. It was just merely because the magazine held a certain number of rounds. This panel of judges or this circuit said that that was a machine gun. So that comes up in this case. So let's let's see how this goes. Let me see. I'm gonna make that All right, this fucking computer's trying to go nuts on me. G23, Bernie, what's up, guys? My brothers. So right now it's just, and I started this a little long, so kind of talk about some things and explain the case again. So this was a case over this dude, Wire Tight, yo, what's up, brother? So this was a case where a guy, not so good guy, had a magazine that I think this was a pistol mag that held more than 15 rounds, is what they're arguing about in this case. This is the appeal on this charge. I haven't been able to find the actual text of the case, so I can nail down everything exactly.
All persons having
Now,
business
I
before the
think the dude
Honorable
caught a
Sessions
bunch of other
Judges
charges, but they're arguing over
outside of the
the
District of Columbia
magazine
is
capacity.
drawing near and give
And
jurisdiction.
you have to listen to the way these judges talk. Like I said,
This court is now in session.
these judges actually say in a former case, they ruled that a gun was a machine gun
Good morning,
merely because it
everybody.
held
Welcome
a
to the District of Columbia Court
certain
of
number of
Appeals.
rounds in the
We
magazine.
have three
It's
cases
insane.
on this morning's calendar, and we will start with case number 22 CF 463, Dana Bruce versus United States.
All right, as long as
Counsel
we're
for
sounding
appellant
good.
Jeffrey Light will be joining us remotely. And Mr. Light, whenever you are ready.
Damn, Bernie, 115. But it's a dry heat.
Okay, one moment.
Let me see if this freaking. Yeah, let me crank this up.
Okay, thank you. Good morning and may it please the court. I'm Jeffrey Light on behalf of appellant Dana Bruce. I'd like to start this morning by discussing the sufficiency of the evidence on the large capacity ammunition feeding device charge. As this court explained in a case called McNeely, there are 4 factors that the court needs to consider in determining whether a mens rea is required for
Yeah, this was
an
DC.
offense. And only one of those is at issue here, which is the contextual rules of the common law. The government doesn't contest that the remaining 3 favor the appellant, and those remaining 3 are whether the crime is a public welfare offense. It is not. Whether strict liability.
Oh, counsel, can I just interrupt you? So I'm sure I'm oriented as to what argument you're making. I mean, you have 2 different styles of argument. One is a sufficiency argument, even if regarding whether or not there was even evidence that this magazine held 12 rounds of ammunition. And then there's the predicate statutory interpretation question of whether or not knowledge is a requirement. And I take it you're addressing the second half of that right now.
Yes.
Okay.
I guess I'm going in reverse order.
Okay.
Mr. Light, it would be helpful to me if you discuss our case in Moore. And let me
I'm still
add
trying
a
to
little
find
more to
exactly
my
which
question.
case he's talking
Sure.
about in this Moore case.
The Moore case dealt with facts very much like this. The Moore case was decided after Staples and affirmed. I'm not sure I agree with the reasoning
This
in
bounce and
Moore,
ass connection.
but as a panel of 3, I think we're bound by it. So why is your case distinguishable from Moore?
Well, I think the most obvious reason is that Moore, as well as the subsequent case in Re Diaz, dealt with machine guns and sawed-off shotguns, respectively. And those are 2 particularly important things because in Staples, those are 2 categories that the Supreme Court identified as being potentially quasi-suspect categories. Here, we are not dealing with either of those things.
Hey,
We're
Art
dealing
Guns,
with
what's up, brother man?
ammunition feeding devices. And so the question,
If you'll excuse me, in Moore, the weapon did not fire automatically. It was a machine gun only because of its capacity. And all of the
Now listen to what he said. These judges, there is in United States Code a definition of what a machine gun is. It's a definition that's been accepted since 1934 in the NFA. That's when it was actually defined in code. And these guys said, well, it's a machine gun merely because it's capacity, not that it functions as a machine gun, not that it fired, more than one round with a single function of the trigger. Nope, just capacity.
The 15 rounds of ammunition in were contained in the magazine. So that government didn't have to prove that Mr. Moore knew there were 15 rounds in the magazine.
So while I agree with you that there might have been a little bit of confusion by this court in referring to something as a machine gun that we would not normally consider a machine gun.
Means the
That
court
was
just made
their
the shit up.
analysis. The analysis was the Supreme Court used the word machine gun. The word machine gun is at issue here. So I think that gives this court freedom to actually look at the specific statute here, which is not the statute at issue in Moore. The statute at issue in Moore, the machine gun provision was repealed. And part of the basis for this court's decision in Moore was that that specific statute at issue there, the legislative history of it was to
Shauna,
deal
what's
with
up, sister?
particular items that were of a quasi-suspect character. The statute that we're dealing with here is entirely different. It doesn't have that legislative history. It doesn't come along with other types of items that also would fit into that quasi-suspect classification. So what we have in this case
Gotta
for
give this
legislative history
quasi-suspect
is the
shit.
DC Council not saying specifically whether or not they intend for knowledge to be an element. So there's silence on that. The government suggests that the court should decide based on the police chief's testimony. But even if that were credited, it's notable that the chief of police never said that these high capacity ammunition clips have no lawful use.
God,
She
man.
said that about a number of other things,
These people,
but
and their
not this.
terminology is so
And
far
so
off.
Why should we look to the legislative history? I've been browbeaten by the Supreme Court into focusing on plain language of the statute. Although Diaz and Moore interpreted a different statute, that statute is worded almost identically to the one at issue here,
Yeah,
in the
it's all
sense that it
political
says
word.
in barest terms,
It's all
no one in the District of
change what words
Columbia shall
mean so
possess.
that we can,
And reading language like that in light of Staples, our court
warp people's opinion about stuff.
declined to require
Lord,
proof of
what's
knowledge.
up, brother?
So whether or not this court was correct to look at the legislative history and more.
But this court
If
actually
the court
saying that
does not
something
look at
was
the
a machine
legislative
gun
history here, there is
because it
no
held a certain
indication
number of
that
rounds is
there was
absolutely insane.
an intent by the council or anything in the text to make this a strict liability offense. The court does look at the
Of course,
legislative
now in this
history.
case, they're
It needs
looking
to
at
look at the
the number
legislative
of rounds in the
history
magazine as
of
being
the
that high
statute at
capacity
issue,
ammunition
not
feeding
some other
device. It's
statute,
illegal.
the relevant provision of which has since been
'Cause if you
repealed.
got one more round than what the
Counsel,
government
can I
says you
just,
have,
I mean,
and that's
in what
that's prison
respects?
time.
It's a very basic question, because we're talking about statutory interpretation. And really the question is, did the trial court err in some respect? So you have two arguments. One is, well, the evidence was insufficient to prove that he knew. We're not talking about that. The second one, I take it, is a response to a jury note that the jury was improperly instructed. This is sort of the framework for your argument. The jury should have been told that they had to find that Mr. Bruce knew the magazine held more than
See,
10 rounds. But as to that
This is
claim,
where we talk about.
you didn't make an
jury
argument like that
nullification
before the
of
trial
these.
court, did you?
Well, there's
the
actually
jury
also
just
a third
refuses to
claim on that
convict,
theory of ineffective
what can the
assistance of
court do?
counsel.
Besides
for
trying to
not
get another
making,
jury.
That argument. The trial counsel simply
I wish more people
no,
would
the
realize
government
they
doesn't
don't
need to
have
prove
to
it. So we
convict.
agree that it wasn't preserved, but I think the easiest route for the court to go, and the route that the court has to go one way or the other, is looking at the sufficiency of the evidence. Even if the court agrees on the instructional error, it would still need to determine whether there can be a retrial on it. So it still needs to reach sufficiency of the evidence, which is extremely weak here. The government alludes to facts that they contend suggest that the defendant knew that the gun was loaded, but they never suggest that there are any facts that point to him knowing that it was loaded with 12 bullets. And there's notable
Yeah,
lack of any evidence in this case that would support it.
So I
There's no
think DC,
DNA
I think they've got
fingerprints on the
a
magazine.
10-round
There's
limit.
no evidence as to how he got the gun. A gun, unlike the
But most
machine
people,
gun
if you
and
just, if they
sawed-off
just look at a
shotgun,
magazine,
you wouldn't be able to tell
You
from just looking at this pistol
they can't tell how many rounds will
rounds it
actually fit in
contains in
that
the
magazine.
magazine. And that was something that was
And what
of
if it is a
importance to this court
20-something
in
round
deciding
magazine, but
both
it's
Moore
been
and
pinned,
Diaz.
so you can only put 10 rounds,
And so there,
which is what
the
they do to a lot of
government's
mags in these
evidence
freaking
on
dumbass
this is simply insufficient. And perhaps that is why the jury asked that question. They recognized that there was not much for them to go off of there. And in fact, the
Counsel-
government, go ahead.
In your reply brief, you argue that voluntarily and on purpose, not by mistaken accident, is the functional equivalent of knowledge. And so you seem to be saying that the instruction here does contain a knowledge requirement. And so essentially the jury was instructed on a knowledge requirement and then was given a
It can be really
perhaps
boring listening to
confusing,
some of this
in
stuff.
your view, confusing
Unless you nerd out like
response
I
on its
do and
note
get into
by the
how these
court.
judges
But
are actually trying
under
to
a plain error standard,
bend
it
everything.
seems like
to
you're
fit.
acknowledging that the jury was at least initially correctly instructed. So where's the plain error?
So the jury was correctly instructed in the
instead of
sense that they
looking
were
at
not
things
incorrectly
in-
instructed. There is a knowledge
like the rule of
requirement in the
lenity
Red
and
Book.
things like
Says
that. These judges
what
really
is
feel that
unclear
it's
from the
their
Red Book
job
requirement, or
to
from the Red
make
Book
the
statement,
state's
is whether that
case.
knowledge requirement applies to every element of the statute, or just one.
If they
just
didn't work
knowledge
that way,
of
none of these
possession.
gun laws
And
would
so the
survive.
plain error here was the trial court failing to recognize that it applies to every element of the statute. And that would have been obvious in light of cases from the Supreme Court, like Torres, in which the Supreme Court specifically reaffirmed that the knowledge requirement, the mens rea requirement, will apply to every element. And this court's decision in Carroll to the same extent.
But this goes back to Judge Fisher's question. How can we say that would have been plain to the trial court in light of Moore and in light of In re Diaz, where despite those general pronouncements that you have to have knowledge as to every element,
And see, that's
um,
another thing. These laws.
we
are
said, well,
written in a way
not when
where
it
they are
comes
vague.
to a 15-round clip and more, that
rule
is
of
what
lenity
made the
doesn't
semi-automatic
apply. They're
weapon
not applying that.
a
What they're
machine
doing
gun, I
Is,
think, under our law.
is instead of seeing
Even though
things
I think that
on
gun people might not use that terminology.
accused
And
on their behalf.
so
They see things
Moore's at
as
least
vague,
very
where-
close to this
the
case,
state
so I have a
just
hard
has
time
that
seeing
much
how
more
the
power.
argument holds water that it would be plain error.
So he didn't
to
have
think
to
that
know
Moore
that it
controlled the
had,
question,
you know,
as
so many
defense counsel
rounds in
thought.
the mag.
So
Even though there's no intent clause written into the law,
there isn't really much
it's
of an
just more
explanation
ways
in
to
the
shove
record
shit on the
as to
state side.
why the
'Cause they're always
trial court
playing a
reached the
game of
conclusion it did.
Hide and go fuck
say
yourself,
anything about
and
Moore.
you get to go,
But it should have
yourself.
been obvious that this is not the statute
and
at
the state
issue.
wins.
And
For sure, I mean, it is a different statute, but the reasoning it's a very slight extension from Moore to conclude that because you didn't need to have knowledge of the quality that made the gun a machine gun and more, that being that it had a 15-round clip, it would make sense that you wouldn't need to have knowledge of what made this clip a high capacity ammunition feeding device, which is that
So
it
that's
held
where
12
we land, is the
rounds.
number
I
of
mean,
rounds in the magazine.
Again, I think as like Judge
Makes
Fisher
the
said,
judge.
I'm not sure how convincing Moore is in light of Staples. But we said it, it's a
It's
holding.
insane.
And this feels like just a really short distance from Moore, even if
Absolutely insane.
they concern different statutes.
Well, if the court was following the rationale in Moore, it would have seen that Moore said a machine gun was at issue in Staples, a machine gun is at issue here. So that's the reasoning. It wouldn't have thought a high capacity magazine was at issue in the Supreme Court. And so it's at issue here. So those are very different things.
I mean, it's not very different though, because that's the only thing that made it a machine gun in Moore.
But one of them is 12 rounds and one of them is 10 rounds. And there's a distinction because as I
Yeah, you're right, Wilbur. I am walking over the video. Sue me.
point out in my brief, capacity of 10 rounds and greater is in common use. I'd like to reserve the remainder of my time for rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. Light. We'll now hear from counsel for the government.
So now we get to the state's end of this. And the state's end's gonna be pretty well.
Good morning, Your Honors. May it please the court. Mark Hobel for the United States. The trial court did not large capacity magazine. It did not air at all. Moore governs this case. Judge Fisher, you asked Mr. Light whether we need to look to legislative history given or should start with the plain text. We start with the plain text. Textually, the large capacity magazine statute does not include a mens rea requirement, as Mr. Light conceded in his opening brief. It does not contain the word knowingly.
On the other hand, we insist on mens rea in the sense that we require knowing and voluntary possession of the magazine.
That is correct, and that's an interpretation that that's how this court has construed the word possession, which is in the statute. But in order to get to the knowledge of the operative characteristic, we lack that word knowingly. So
Again, this is another one of those cases of ignorance of the law is no excuse. But we're to a point, man, where you got so many different criminal laws, state and federal, district in this case. Nobody can keep up with this crap. I guarantee you there are gun owners right now that are out there that have built guns. They ordered all these parts. They put this gun together. This is a cool gun. That's their baby. I will guarantee you they have a 10-year felony sitting there because they just didn't know NFA restrictions. They didn't know, hey, you can't have a barrel under 16 inches with a stock on the gun unless you have it, registered, Form 1, all that crap, or Form 1, I think Form 1. But they don't know that. They just built a cool gun. And they're not plugged in, like a lot of us are, to the different laws and the hoops you have to jump through. But again, the state will just say that, hey, even though you didn't know about a law, even though you didn't intend to break a law, you still broke the law. So we get to send you to prison.
the next kind of textual step in the textual analysis is to look to, is there a presumption of mens rea? Under federal law and Staples held that in construing the federal machine gun law, there was a presumption of mens rea. However, under this court's precedent in Re Diaz and Moore, this court held that there is no such precedent when interpreting a similar ban in which machine gun was defined by its ammunition capacity, just like this statute. So in fact, the presumption in our law, whether it's a matter of first.
Did you catch that? Machine gun is defined by its magazine capacity. this is the only case that I've heard this in where a machine gun was defined by capacity of the ammunition feeding device, like they want to call it, the magazine. That's the only thing that made it a machine gun. It wasn't the way it operates. It didn't fire more than one round for a single operation of the trigger. This is insane, and they're building off of other insanity, and it just keeps getting more insane as it goes. And these judges sitting up here are supposed to be the arbiters. They're supposed to call balls and strikes. Something is constitutional, something is not constitutional. If it's not a power given to a government in the Constitution, then the government doesn't have that power. That power falls to the people. That's the way it's supposed to work. And this is DC, so they're governed under the federal Constitution. Yeah, this whole freaking barrel length idea of short-barreled rifle, all this crap, is horseshit, and it's been horseshit since the 1934 NFA. I've showed on stream before. Hell, did it live. And right now those guns are in safe, but I showed that my AK pistol is actually longer than my side folding AK when my side folder is actually in the folded position. Chris, what's up, brother? So this whole barrel length crap. I mean, obviously the handgun is the most concealable. But then they get hung up on, well, it fires a rifle round. Okay. And for each time you step down on that barrel length, once you get, probably below 10.5, you end up losing a hell of a lot of velocity, which ends up tamping down the terminal ballistics of the round. So that, and that AR pistol is not concealable. These people are insane. But hey, they're judges, so
First impression this court would reach or not, as a matter of precedent.
Why would we have a different presumption, given all the reasons that the Supreme Court provided for the presumption in Staples, which aren't really jurisdiction based? They are first principles based, and they are, I mean, there wasn't really a constitutional basis in Staples per se, but there were certainly concerns about notice and similar concerns.
Well, that's correct, Your Honor. And in Moore, this court actually addressed Staples directly and said, under the statutory scheme that Congress enacted for the District of Columbia, anyone who knowingly and intentionally possesses a weapon in this jurisdiction does so at his or her own risk. In effect, the law obligates such a person to make sure the weapon is not of the prohibited variety. The Moore court specifically addressed the Staples statutory presumption, said there's a different presumption that applies here under DC law. We are construing Congress's acts and the council's acts differently here. And that precedent is binding and governs this case because as Mr. Light acknowledges, the way that machine gun was defined in Moore was based on its ammunition capacity. And in fact, if you look at, and this is sort of a third principle of textual analysis that favors the government here, if you think about the reenactment canon, the presumption that the legislature is aware of the court's precedents when it enacts a new law, well, I think it was in fact the same year that Moore was decided, the council enacted the large capacity magazine statute, banning high capacity magazines in the same way that the machine gun statute that was at issue in Moore was addressed to ammunition capacity. So that's a third textual principle that favors the government here.
Let me ask you about a feature of this case that makes me wonder whether we should follow Moore. Since the record was recently supplemented, we have a couple of nice photographs of the firearm. And this magazine fits precisely into the hand grip of the pistol. It does not extend below. It looks like this pistol was made to hold a 12-round clip. So by looking at this firearm, there is nothing to alert Mr. Bruce, arguably, that there is anything unusual about this magazine.
I think that's visually and factually that's correct, Your Honor, but I would direct this court's attention to footnote 17 in the Moore case, which addressed a similar issue, which said, look, our holding in re DS seemed to rely on the visual characteristics of the item. But in fact, we're really talking about a statutory presumption against mens rea here. There may be affirmative defenses, none of which apply here and haven't been raised here, that would address some of the innocent possession and so forth. But footnote 17 in more directly addresses Your Honor's point, which is.
So how do you, I've read that footnote with interest, and how do you think that affirmative defense would work? Would it be like self-defense, that the defendant has to raise it, but once raised, the government has to disprove it? In other words, the government would have to prove knowledge here if he claimed lack of knowledge?
Yes, but I think that the specific affirmative defense that footnote is alluding to, they cited to the Worthy case, a precedent of this court from 1980, which is addressed to, and Worthy and the cases it discusses address innocent possession. So what happens if you see a gun or a large capacity?
Gabber, what's up, brother?
And you want to keep it out by a playground, and you want to keep it out of the hands of kids. So you're possessing it knowingly. In fact, you know what it is, but you're taking it to a police station. So what you're doing is in the public good, and it's for public safety reasons. That is an affirmative defense. I don't think.
I mean,
But innocent possession doesn't strike me as relevant here.
It's not relevant here, but that's the limited nature of the affirmative defense that footnote 17 is talking about it more.
no, I mean,
And these cats with this magazine crap, they wouldn't care if you picked it up out of the street and were carrying it to the police station. They are going to arrest you and charge you and try to convict you. Excuse me. This is why these judges sitting here is why I warn people that the Biden administration has put well over 100 judges on the district and circuit courts. And those judges are basically handpicked to support their agenda. So when we see, I'm absolutely surprised that the pistol brace stuff has got the injunctions that it's got. And shitty as it is, it's only protecting people who are members of an organization or work for the state. To me, that's retarded. It should have been an injunction, period. But other judges sitting on these courts are going to basically uphold any kind of gun control that the Biden administration can push through, or the ATF can regulate their little self, into oblivion with. And these guys, following it and watching some of the stuff that I've watched in the last little while, Biden and Chuck Schumer and all them have not ruled out adding more seats to the Supreme Court. Matter of fact, I think there's one or two bills in Congress right now to do that. This next election coming up is going to be kind of a pivotal deal. And these last elections have made me just where I'm freaking, I don't trust any of the damn. No, this P38, this happened like a week ago. Let me see. Let me shrink this down. So this was 12 days ago. So almost 2 weeks ago now. So this is a fresh case. They haven't, as far as I know, they haven't written their opinion on this case yet.
I mean, it says excusable ignorance is the affirmative defense it's talking about. You're not discussing, I mean, so the ignorance is never excusable unless some other affirmative defense applies. Is that your thinking?
Well, mistake of fact can be a defense where there is a mens rea element. Here, there is no mens rea element with respect to the ammunition capacity. I'm not sure to what extent, you know, the Moore court was, I think the Moore court was sort of suggesting there may be limited affirmative defenses of the sort that I've already addressed. I don't think it was trying to make a more general point about, you know, or going beyond that. And certainly no affirmative defense has been advanced in this case.
I guess, could you just maybe let's talk a little bit about whether or not Moore makes any sense. Because one way of looking at this is we have Staples, a Supreme Court case that looks very similar to this and says, you know, in particular, because the thing that made that gun, machine gun, was a hidden characteristic of it that the jury could have found the defendant didn't know about. Same is true here. It'd be quite easy to find that the defendant didn't know this one.
Now, the case they're talking about in Staples, if I'm remembering this right, a guy was sold an AR style rifle, and I think it was a malfunction where it fired more than one round with a single operation of the trigger. He had no idea this gun was a machine gun when he bought the gun. And I can't remember how he got trapped up and all that. Anyway, it goes to court. He gets convicted in lower courts. I think an appellate court kicked it back and said this needs to be retried, and made its way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that he had no knowledge of this being a machine gun. So, you know, it's kind of a no harm, no foul. Government gets the gun, all that. He still had to go through hundreds of thousands of dollars, really, to defend himself against this crap. So that's the Staples case that they're talking about involving that machine gun. So that was mens rea, a knowing knowingly committing the crime of having this gun was what it came down to. He didn't know, so he ended up, I guess, I'll have to look up the other or the last bit of it, but I do believe he ended up the Supreme Court overturned the conviction. Again, still had to fight it out in court, still had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to do so, because that was not a cheap case to make it all the way to the Supreme Court. And it took a very long time. Yeah. And that's about all it would take to get a conviction on a gun these days. Hell, the government right now wants to have to register your so-called like adult air guns. They finally caught on to the fact that there are air guns out there that shoot as high as a 50 caliber pellet, and they want to take care of that. So, you know, no one's using these air rifles in crimes. I haven't read a single case where someone has used one of these air rifles in a crime. So I guess they're trying to head it off. I don't know. These people are retarded. It's the insanity of it.
Was a 12 clip magazine. And Moore's leans heavily on In re DS. And In re DS's reasoning as well, anybody can see if a shotgun barrel is less than 20 inches. Okay. And I guess one way of looking at it is, sure, more controls as to whether or not something is machine gunned under the statute that it was interpreting. But whether or not it should be extended to a new statute should depend somewhat on its persuasion.
History, if you think there is ambiguity, you can turn to the legislative history. And the committee report makes clear that the large capacity magazine ban is a direct descendant of the machine, because after the Heller decision by the Supreme Court, the district rewrote some of its gun laws, had to reformulate them. And part of the problem with defining a machine gun as a semi-automatic handgun capable of holding a certain certain capacity ammunition is you ended up banning the handguns, even if they didn't have the magazine in them.
Right. Every semi-automatic handgun could be a machine gun under the prior statute. All you have to do is, it's capable of taking.
And trust me, kids, that was a feature of that legislation, not a bug. They were trying to ban anything that could take a detachable magazine where that magazine could hold more than 10 rounds. That was the idea. That was the way that legislation was written. That's what they wanted to do. And these judges upheld that shit. They should have laughed the state out of court on that shit. But these judges, this circuit, upheld that. You can't depend on the courts to uphold your rights, because they're simply not going to. Yeah, P38. I still have to figure this out, because I've said it before about people with PhDs. I'm not sure whether they were that stupid before they got a PhD, or whether they stood there in the graduation and when they flipped that tassel over, it just shut their damn common sense off. I'm not sure which one, because if it was the tassel, maybe we can get them all back into the same formation and have them just switch the tassel over and turn their common sense back on. Because common sense says that a machine gun that has had a legal definition since 1934, it's been in code since 1934 in federal code, you can't shoehorn a semi-automatic firearm into that. But they did it just because magazine capacity. Oh, it holds more than so many rounds, it's a machine gun. Oh yeah, Sam, they would. I mean, once the 34 NFA was allowed to stand, and you came up with these different tests for whether or not a arm was covered under the Second Amendment, it basically screwed everything right there. There are no tests written into the Second Amendment, federal Second Amendment. There's no test written into it. There is no, well, if it's used in a crime, then it can be banned. There is no, well, if a certain amount of people die from it every year, then it can be banned. There is no public or greater good written into it. It shall not be infringed. The strongest legal language you will see to protect any right in the federal Constitution. I keep saying federal Constitution because that's what it is. That federal Constitution governed federal matters. A lot of these cases, now this is different because this is DC, so this is a federal case. A lot of the stuff in states like, hold on, what'd you say, Warsaw? Laws. Yeah, man, you're right. It's this tangled damn mess of shit. But what I was getting to with some of these other cases, they should be argued off the state constitutions because it is a state matter. The federal government shouldn't come into this in most cases, but everybody goes right to the federal Second Amendment, and that's not where these arguments should be. Um, there is not a single state constitution that gives the government that says in the constitution of the state, this state has the power to regulate arms. That's not in any state constitution, period. Excuse me. And these assholes run around talking about, well, there's no Second Amendment protection in this state or that state. Yeah, but there's nothing in there that gives the government the power to regulate arms. And anything not expressly given to the government in that constitution should fall to the people. So California, for instance, has no real, Second Amendment protection written into their constitution. That's fine. Okay. But there's nothing in that constitution that says that the state has the power to regulate arms. So that power should fall to the people. The government doesn't have that power because the constitution was of a state or of a, federal government was supposed to be lining out what restrictions were put onto the government so that the government, couldn't do different acts. They had these guardrails. You got to stay in these guardrails. Anything not listed in these guardrails is the people's domain. That's the way it should be. But this idiotic stuff that we run around with now, yeah, and then that's one of the things that they change that language, or they change the definition of things. Well regulated meant something completely different at the time of the founding than it does now. And I've been on some long chats with ChatGPT about this. The Constitution, and we'll stick with the federal for a minute. The federal Constitution is a legal document that was laid out. This is what this stuff means right now. That's what matters. Well regulated meant trained. Ready to go. Shoot them up. So the states agree to that language. They sign on to it. Okay, we will be part of the United States. We agree to this language. This language says shall not be infringed, which means the federal government has no power to regulate the arms owned in the states. That's what we agreed to then. And then you see this progression, this ball rolling downhill, where they start arguing about what does infringed mean? Well, infringed back then meant any kind of restriction, any kind of delay in being able to own those arms. That's what was agreed to. So any legal contract should be governed by the language that is understood when that document is agreed to, ratified. Doesn't matter how long that contract runs. You shouldn't be able to change the language or what the words mean in the document. If you want to change the document, there are amendment processes you go through. But instead, the left, it just changes what words mean. And then that changes the entire document. Yeah, P-38, 100% right. And we were considered irregular troops. God, I can't remember what I was listening to the other day where they talked about some of this. And then, of course, the leftists are playing a different angle that, oh, well, militia, well, if the army has to train this way, well, then these people in the militia have to train this way. No, that's not the way this works. They're under command to go on a moment's notice, to go overseas, to go fight. The militia is not. It's
15-round clip, right?
I don't know of any, but I imagine that, yeah. Yes, and so, but the council, after hearing testimony from the police chief, and others, was still incredibly concerned about high capacity rounds, which it said in its committee report are more about firepower than self-defense. And in order to, the council chose to ban large capacity magazines in the same way that it had banned large
What's up,
capacity
brother?
guns under the Moore statute. It was solving the problem that the rewrite of the Moore statute created. And, you know, Mr. Light points out, well, I think in his reply brief, something to the effect of, you know, if the council really thought that large capacity magazines were devoid of lawful use, wouldn't they have said it clearly? Well, you can't say it more clearly than banning them outright, which is exactly what the council did here.
But isn't there a huge qualitative difference between a hand grenade and a sawed-off shotgun on one hand and a magazine of ammunition on the other?
Ultimately, our purposes here, the council has determined that there is not. Reasonable minds could differ, but the council has spoken, and the council was aware of this court's, we presume it was aware of this court's precedent in Moore interpreting a capacity ban as not requiring mens rea. I want to make sure that I emphasize too, if the court is at all troubled by this, we're on plain error. And as Judge Gill pointed out, you can't say that the trial court made a clear and obvious and blatant error given the strength of the precedent and under In re DS and more. Even if you think these are thorny issues, that cuts in favor of the government here. I see at this point, I see my time is almost up. Unless the court has any further questions, we would ask this court to affirm Bruce's convictions.
Counsel, I would like to focus a little bit on the jury striking, of course, issue. Wasn't the trial court obligated to ask one or two further questions of this juror during voir dire to suss out whether she was actually going to be unwilling or unable to follow the court's instructions and render an impartial verdict based on the evidence? That question was never really asked, right?
You know, I don't recall. So I suspect in those terms, no, it wasn't. I don't specifically recall, but the answer to your question is no. And certainly Mr. Bruce has not raised any claim of error related to the adequacy of the voir dire. He's challenging the excusal for cause itself. And based on this record and the statements of the juror, which I think you know are fairly straightforward. This juror, I know, was a lawyer, was speaking candidly and openly and out of abundance of caution, and indicated, and again to her credit, I think indicated, you know, she was probably going to give less weight to police officer witnesses, the evidence they provided, because they're police.
But Mr. Light argues that she was rehabilitated. And when I read the transcript, there is at least some of that apparent on the record. She said, well, you know, I could probably be fair and impartial.
Yeah, I think the defense counsel asked sort of a vaguely worded question at the end that you know, the trial court took into account, and the trial court said, well, she said she was skeptical, we're going to be more skeptical of police, and she didn't take it back. And that is not clearly erroneous on this record. She did not take that back. She was clearly struggling with the issue, but you know, and this is an area of law where trial courts are entitled to considerable deference from this court, because they have an opportunity to evaluate the whole picture and the demeanor of this juror, the entirety of the answers, and the judge here did that fairly. And you know, Judge O'Keefe, you know, he emphasized that he was going to apply that rule fairly, and he did. He struck two jurors who indicated they would give police officer testimony more weight than any other witness. And he struck two jurors, including juror 16, who indicated that they would give police officer testimony less weight.
Do you think that's true? I thought too, when you say they would give more weight to police officer testimony, my recollection is one of those witnesses you highlight says something like, I have police officers in my family, I would hold them to a higher standard. That doesn't sound like they're giving their testimony more weight. It sounds like they might be more scrutinizing of officer testimony. Am I misremembering? this?
Yeah, so I think juror 50 said he held police, he was a former officer and held police at a higher level than most people. So I think his statements were directly directly said they're entitled to more. And he answered the question, which was, would you give a police officer more or less weight?
You're right. In fact, he follows up. I think they have earned that trust from me.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So unless the court has any additional questions, we would ask this court to affirm Bruce's convictions.
Great. Thank you, counsel. All right, Mr. Light, we will give you a few minutes for rebuttal.
Thank you. Just one brief thing I wanted to say about the ammunition feeding device is one thing that's changed since Moore is this court's en-banc decision in Carroll. And that's notable because one of the modes of analysis relied on by the court in Moore is whether this is a general intent statute. And in Carroll,
I mean, this dude's hanging his entire case really on whether or not the dude knew that this magazine held more than 10 rounds. So it's the knowing, it's the mens rea. But the state, or in this case, the district, when this law was passed, they purposely left it vague. That so that they could do shit like this.
this court has criticized the use of that terminology and emphasized the need for a mens rea on every element. And turning to the issue of it's pretty straightforward that the judge confused the concept of skepticism with bias, and that he therefore adopted an overly expansive view of what jurors should be struck. And in light of that, I cite to cases in some other jurisdictions upholding that, but I think skepticism is an important thing for jurors to have. It's part of their process of evaluating credibility, and it's based on their life experiences. On the other hand, when this court talks about—
honestly, man, especially with all the evidence that's out there, any juror that hits the jury box and doesn't come at it completely skeptical of the government's case is a moron at this point, because we've seen guys go down for machine guns that aren't machine guns, or people get charged with a malfunctioning gun. What was that one tag? The smallest machine gun. It was something that got in the trigger mechanism. We've seen that guy from the Navy where, I mean, they flat out set his ass up. He bought legal products from Gunbroker, and then the ATF comes in and says, well, these receivers weren't cut the way that we wanted them cut, even though they don't tell you exactly how to cut them. They charge them with machine guns. They repair a demilled rocket launcher tube, put their own trigger mechanism in it, get it to fire, charge this guy with having, destructive devices. There's all sorts of shady shit these guys are doing. So if any of these jurors that hit this and that with this faith in what the state's doing, man, at this point they are unfucking fixable, because there's so much in your face these days about what the government's doing and the shady ass games they're playing. Look at Hunter Biden. All these issues with taxes, lying on a 4473, and what do? He might end up with misdemeanor and some probation. Where there are other people that, you know, they were smoking weed and said they weren't, a user of illegal substances. They want to throw their asses in jail for, 5 years, 10 years. I think the Cam Edwards might have been said it earlier today in a show that, the norm was like 10 to 21 months in the federal prison for lying on a 4473. But nope, this dude is a complete piece of shit. He's got evidence, video evidence that he's a complete piece of shit. But no, he's just probation, and and all they're trying to do is clear that shit up. So when Biden gets asked any questions like that, if he does do anything public before the next election, he can go, "My son was punished, and all that is squashed, and it's all been dealt with." And the justice system, well, they were impartial and all that. It's horse shit. And judges who uphold this are pieces of shit. Doesn't matter whether you like the item or not. Doesn't matter whether you like the way it looks. Doesn't matter if it was used in a crime or anything like that. If that power is not given to the government in a constitutional authority, then they don't have the power to do it. That's the way people used to believe. I've read in done shows on the hearings for the 1934 NFA. There were people there that wanted to just go ahead and ban everything. And they were told then, look, the government does not have the power to do that. We can't just ban machine guns, so we're going to tax them. You got to have them in commerce for us to tax them. Even though the only people that could really afford that $200 tax at the time were the criminals or super rich people. And there was no prohibition on felons owning firearms at the time. That didn't come into 60 something. So the criminals still got their fucking guns. And of course they did it illegally anyway, so it really didn't matter. But man, it's this circular fucking logic. We just need more gun laws. Well, we'll get another gun law, and then we'll need more gun laws, and then maybe fuck off.
Bias and not being able to put bias out of the way. That is something more like an unfounded stereotype. But even then, the question is whether there were potentially other questions the Superior Court judge could have asked.
Here we go with the signal again.
That was up to the court and the government. The government juror should be.
Give that a second. Because apparently the signal decided to get stupid again. At least on my end. Hell, I'll let it play and see what happens.
Struck, and therefore the government was the party bearing the burden of establishing the record on that issue. That is something that runs against the government on the current record. I would also say that this case very closely mirrors the situation in Mason. There isn't a lot of difference between the two cases, and for those reasons, we urge you to reverse.
Thank you, counsel. We appreciate the parties' briefs and their arguments, and the case is taken under advisement. Next up, we have case number.
All right. So the next couple cases in this don't have anything to do with firearms, I don't think. I think they were I'd have to go back and listen to it again. I think that was the only case in there that really dealt with firearms or magazines or anything like that. So anyway, I'm going to call this one kind of a successful stream, halfway successful. I mean, we actually made it through that without completely dropping off the damn map and having to restart. So that's a plus. So I'm going to go ahead and end it. And then we'll see, because there's still some other hearings and stuff that I've had stacked up for the last 2 weeks that I want to get to, because they're really important, and people need to see it. So I am going to end this one here, though, guys. So as always, you perps be cool. Keep that thing on you at all times. And realize the government really does hate you, and they want you disarmed or dead or in prison, whichever one. I mean, they're pretty cool with all of it, as we've seen. So you guys all be cool. So Gabber, P38, G23, Warsaw, Mike McClune was in earlier. Shauna came in. Tactical FUD, my brother. Of course, I already said P38 because P38's the fucking man. Sam, man, good to see you again, brother. Thanks for coming in. Gabber, Chris, come in. What's up, my brother? If I missed anybody, I'm sorry. But yeah, I'm gonna end it. So again, perks be cool, thing on you at all times. Get some training if you can. At least, the very least, do some dry fire. You guys be cool, man. I love all you guys.